Hello, my friends. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and the day my husband was buried, his family tried to throw me out of the house. Not weeks later, not months later, the same day, 3 hours after we lowered his coffin into the ground. I was still wearing black. My mascara was still smudged from crying, and they were already standing in my living room telling me I didn't belong there. But the part that still amazes me isn't what they did. It's how confident they were when they did it. Because they believed something very simple. They believed that once Daniel was gone, I had no one left to protect me. What they didn't know was that Daniel had already thought about that, and he had left something behind, something that would change everything. But I didn't know that yet. At that moment, all I knew was that my husband of 15 years was gone, and the people standing in my house had never liked me. The funeral had been that morning. Cold, gray, the kind of sky that makes the whole world feel heavy. Daniel's parents stood on one side of the grave. His sister Margaret stood beside them holding an umbrella like she was attending a business meeting instead of her brother's burial. They didn't cry, they didn't speak to me, they barely even looked at me. And that wasn't new. Daniel's family had never truly accepted me. From the moment we got married, I was always the outsider, the woman who had somehow taken their son away. Even after 15 years, they still treated me like a temporary guest in Daniel's life. The priest finished the final prayer. People began drifting away slowly. Friends hugged me. Neighbors whispered condolences. But Daniel's family left without saying a single word to me. At the time, I thought they were just grieving in their own way. I didn't realize they were already planning something else. When I arrived back at the house an hour later, the first thing I noticed was the cars. 3 of them parked in the driveway. Daniel's parents' car, Margaret's car, and a black sedan I didn't recognize. For a moment, I assumed they had come to collect a few sentimental items. Old photographs, family heirlooms. That would have been reasonable. What I walked into was not. When I stepped through the front door, Danielle's mother was standing in the living room holding a folder. Margaret stood beside her with her arms crossed. And the man in the black sedan stood near the fireplace, flipping through a stack of papers. They all looked up when I entered. The silence in the room felt rehearsed, like they had been waiting for me. Danielle's mother spoke first. "Eleanor," she said stiffly, "we need to discuss the house." The words confused me. "The house?" I repeated. Margaret stepped forward before her mother could answer. "Yes," she said flatly. "This house belongs to our family." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Margaret gestured around the room like she was pointing out something obvious. "This property has been in the Hayes family for 40 years. "Yes," I said slowly, "and Daniel and I have lived here for 15. She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "That doesn't make it yours." For a moment I thought she was joking, but then the man by the fireplace cleared his throat. He walked toward us holding the papers. "My name is Mr. Collins," he said calmly. "I represent the Hayes family." The word represent made my stomach tighten. "I don't understand," I said. Danielle's mother opened the folder she was holding. "These are the original property documents," she said. "They show that the house was never transferred out of the Hayes family trust." My heart started beating faster. Danielle had always handled the legal paperwork in our marriage. The mortgage, the taxes, everything. But we had been married 15 years. This was our home. "Our home," I said quietly. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Not anymore." Then she said the sentence I will never forget. "You can collect your belongings tonight. Tomorrow morning, we expect you to leave." The room felt like it tilted. I looked from Margaret to Danielle's mother, waiting for someone to correct the cruelty in her voice. No one did. "Daniel just died," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. Margaret shrugged. And that one word told me everything. To them, Daniel's death wasn't a tragedy. It was an opportunity. Daniel's mother stepped forward. "We're willing to give you a few days," she said, as if she were offering charity. "But legally, this house isn't yours." I felt something strange then. Not panic, not anger, just a deep, hollow disbelief. 15 years of marriage, and they were throwing me out like a stranger. I looked around the living room. Every piece of furniture, every photo, every memory of the life Daniel and I had built together, and suddenly none of it felt safe anymore. Margaret glanced at the man beside her. "Mr. Collins will handle the paperwork," she said. He nodded politely. "We'll begin formal proceedings tomorrow morning." Formal proceedings. They were already preparing to remove me from the home I had shared with my husband for half my life. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, the doorbell rang. Everyone in the room turned toward the sound. Margaret frowned. "We're not expecting anyone." Danielle's mother looked irritated. "I told the caterer we didn't need anything else." The doorbell rang again, longer this time. Mr. Collins walked to the door and opened it. A man in a gray suit stood on the porch, holding a leather briefcase. "I'm looking for Mrs. Eleanor Hayes," he said. I stepped forward slowly. "That's me." The man nodded. "My name is Jonathan Pierce. I'm Daniel Hayes's attorney." The room went completely silent, because Daniel had never mentioned another lawyer. Mr. Pierce looked at me gently. "I believe your husband left something that needs to be read today." Margaret frowned immediately. "We already have legal representation." Mr. Pierce raised a hand calmly. "This isn't about property filings." He opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. "Daniel's." My heart started pounding. Margaret stepped forward sharply. "What is that?" Mr. Pierce looked directly at me. "It's a letter," he said, "from your husband." Danielle's mother scoffed. "A sentimental note doesn't change the legal ownership of this house." Mr. Pierce didn't respond. Instead, he looked down at the envelope again, then back at me. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "your husband instructed me to read this immediately after his funeral." The words hung in the air. Margaret crossed her arms impatiently. "Fine," she snapped. "Read it." Mr. Pierce slowly broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and began reading the first line. And the moment he spoke Daniel's words, I realized something. My husband had known exactly what his family would try to do, and he had already prepared for it. The room was so quiet I could hear the paper move in Mr. Pierce's hands. Margaret leaned against the arm of the couch with her arms crossed, already looking bored. Danielle's mother stood stiffly beside her, clutching the folder of property documents like it was proof that the conversation was already over. And I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at my husband's handwriting. I hadn't seen it since the hospital, since the last birthday card he gave me. Since the last grocery list he left on the kitchen counter. Now it was on a letter that was being opened after his funeral. Mr. Pierce cleared his throat and began to read. "To my wife Eleanor." My chest tightened. Just hearing Daniel's words out loud felt unreal. "If you're hearing this letter, it means I didn't get the chance to explain everything to you myself." Margaret rolled her eyes slightly, but Mr. Pierce kept reading. "First, Eleanor, I'm sorry." The apology hit me harder than I expected, because Daniel had spent the last 6 months in and out of hospitals while the doctors tried to treat the heart condition that eventually took him. He had apologized constantly during that time for being tired, for missing dinner, for making me worry, and every time I told him the same thing. "You don't need to apologize for being sick," but the letter continued. "I'm sorry I kept certain things from you. I did it because I didn't want you carrying the weight of my family's behavior while we were still building our life together." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Danielle's mother's lips tightened, but neither of them interrupted. "You always believed that if we worked hard and stayed kind, people would eventually treat us the same way." Mr. Pierce paused slightly before reading the next line. "I knew my family better than that." The air in the room felt heavier. Margaret straightened slightly. "That's ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. Mr. Pierce continued. "I also knew that the moment I wasn't here anymore, they would try to take things from you." The silence in the room sharpened. Margaret uncrossed her arms. Danielle's mother looked directly at the lawyer for the first time. Mr. Pierce read the next line slowly. "Especially the house." Margaret let out a short laugh. "Well, obviously," she said, "this house has always belonged to the Hayes family, but Mr. Pierce didn't stop, which is why, 3 years ago, I made sure the house would belong to Eleanor instead." The sentence landed like a stone dropping into water. Margaret blinked. "What?" Danielle's mother frowned deeply. Mr. Pierce continued reading. "The Hayes family trust that originally held the property was legally dissolved and the title was transferred to a new private trust under Eleanor's name." Margaret's face turned red. "That's not possible." Danielle's mother turned sharply toward Mr. Collins. "You said the property was still in the Hayes Trust." Mr. Collins looked suddenly less confident. "The records we reviewed suggested." Mr. Pierce raised the envelope slightly. Danielle anticipated this confusion. He removed another folded document from the briefcase and placed it on the coffee table. It was a legal certificate, stamped, signed, official. "This is the updated property title," Mr. Pierce said calmly. "It lists Eleanor Hayes as the sole beneficiary and owner of the residence." Margaret grabbed the document and scanned it quickly. Her face went pale. That's impossible." Danielle's mother's voice was tight with anger. "He can't just remove family property like that." Mr. Pierce looked at her politely. "He could, and he did. For the first time since they had walked into my house that afternoon." Danielle's family looked uncertain, but the letter wasn't finished. Mr. Pierce lifted the paper again. If my family is present when this letter is read, Margaret's eyes snapped back to him. Then I assume they've already tried to tell Eleanor that she doesn't belong here. Mr. Pierce paused, then read the next line. That would be very typical of them. Margaret slammed the document down on the table. This is ridiculous. Danielle's mother spoke sharply. This letter doesn't change the history of this property. Mr. Pierce didn't argue. He simply read the next line. Eleanor, if you're hearing this, please don't argue with them. You don't need to defend yourself. My throat tightened. Because that sounded exactly like Danielle. Calm, practical, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Mr. Pierce continued. The house belongs to you now. Completely and legally. Margaret scoffed loudly. We'll see about that, but Mr. Pierce wasn't finished. And Eleanor, there's one more thing you need to know. My heart started beating faster. Because Daniel had never written long letters. He was a man who said what he meant quickly and directly, which meant the next part mattered. Mr. Pierce looked up briefly before reading the next line. If my family tried to remove you from this house today, Margaret's expression darkened. Then Jonathan has instructions to show them the rest of the documents. The word documents made the room feel colder. Margaret frowned. What documents? Mr. Pierce slowly closed the letter, then reached back into the briefcase. When he pulled out the second folder, it was thicker than the first one. Much thicker. He placed it carefully on the coffee table. Then he said something that made Margaret's face drain of color. These are the financial records Daniel asked me to keep. Daniel's mother stared at the folder. What financial records? Mr. Pierce looked directly at Margaret. The ones involving the money Daniel lent his sister 5 years ago. The room went completely still. Margaret didn't speak, didn't move, but the panic in her eyes was suddenly impossible to miss. And that's when I realized something. Daniel hadn't just prepared to protect me from losing the house. He had prepared for something else. Something his family definitely didn't want revealed. The moment Mr. Pierce mentioned financial records, the energy in the room changed. Margaret's confidence disappeared first. A few minutes earlier, she had been standing in my living room telling me to pack my things. Now she looked like someone who had just remembered a mistake. She hoped no one else would notice. Danielle's mother glanced sharply at her. What financial records? She demanded. Mr. Pierce didn't answer immediately. Instead, he calmly opened the thick folder and slid several documents onto the coffee table. The sound of paper touching wood felt unusually loud. These, he said quietly, are signed agreements between Daniel Hayes and Margaret Hayes regarding a private loan. Margaret's voice snapped out instantly. That was years ago. Daniel's mother turned to her. What loan? Margaret avoided her mother's eyes. It's nothing. But Mr. Pierce gently pushed one of the documents forward. It was $200,000, he said. The number hung in the air like thunder. Danielle's mother blinked in disbelief. 200,000? Margaret looked furious now. Danielle offered to help me. Mr. Pierce nodded slightly. Yes, he did. He tapped the page in front of him. But he also required a written repayment agreement. I stared at the document. Danielle's signature sat at the bottom. So did Margaret's. The date was 5 years earlier. I remembered that year. Margaret had suddenly opened a small design business. At the time, she told everyone she had secured an investor. Apparently, that investor had been my husband. Danielle's mother looked at the contract again, and Mr. Pierce folded his hands calmly. And the agreement included a condition. Margaret stepped forward quickly. That part isn't relevant. Mr. Pierce ignored her. The condition states that if Margaret Hayes failed to repay the loan within 5 years, he flipped to the next page. The outstanding balance would be transferred to a lien against her personal assets. Danielle's mother frowned. What assets? Mr. Pierce didn't look away from Margaret, the house she currently lives in. For the first time since they arrived, Margaret's composure cracked completely. That was never supposed to happen, she snapped. Mr. Pierce remained calm. The 5-year deadline passed last month. Margaret's breathing became heavier. Daniel never said he was going to enforce it. Mr. Pierce closed the folder gently. Daniel didn't need to. The room went quiet again, because everyone had just realized something at the same time. Daniel had set this up long before he died, not out of revenge, but out of preparation. Danielle's mother turned slowly toward Margaret. You borrowed $200,000 from your brother. Margaret crossed her arms defensively. He wanted to help, and you never paid it back. Margaret didn't answer. Which was answer enough, Mr. Pierce continued calmly. The agreement also states that if repayment was not completed by the deadline, the authority to collect the debt transfers to the primary beneficiary of Daniel Hayes' estate. He looked directly at me. That beneficiary is Eleanor Hayes. The words felt unreal. For a moment, I just stared at him. You mean me? Mr. Pierce nodded. Yes. Margaret laughed sharply. That's ridiculous. Mr. Pierce didn't raise his voice. It's legally binding. Margaret pointed at me angrily. She can't take my house. Mr. Pierce raised an eyebrow. You were prepared to remove her from hers less than an hour ago. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Danielle's mother looked furious now. Margaret, she said slowly, is this true? Margaret hesitated. Then she muttered something under her breath. It was supposed to be temporary. Mr. Pierce slid the folder closed again. The remaining balance with interest is now $230,000. Margaret's head sank. That's insane. Mr. Pierce remained. You signed the contract. Danielle's mother suddenly looked less angry. Much more angry than that. You told us your business was successful. Margaret looked back. It was a fault. Mr. Pierce placed the folder in the balance. Mrs. Hayes, he said to me, as Danielle requested, these documents now belong to you. I stared at the folder. For 15 years, Danielle had been the one who handled difficult decisions. The legal matters, the financial protections. Now he was gone, and somehow he had still managed to protect me more than his family. Margaret pointed at me. You're not actually going to pursue it. Her voice sounded less certain now, more desperate. For a moment I didn't answer. I simply looked at her, the same one who had walked into me earlier in the morning before the and I remembered something I knew was stolen. People reward who they are when they believe they have power. Margaret looked at me. Helpless, easier for her side. I told her another story. Margaret. Her eyes locked me. Yes, yes. She came back to me. You wanted me out of the industry. Your jaw tightened. That's different. No, I said quietly. It really isn't. I didn't mean it so. Because for the first time since Daniel came to me, his family did the same. The woman we thought would be in his house was now the only person who had legal power to protect me. And Margaret knew. Her voice dropped. What is that? I looked around the room, the house right now on my doorstep. The house his family had placed me in just to protect me. Then I looked back at him, and I realized something strange. For the first time since Daniel's death, I didn't forget all I said. But what I said next was something Margaret definitely wasn't expecting. Margaret's question stirred her memory. What do you want? A few hours earlier she had walked into my house looking angry. Now she was standing in the same living room, looking like someone who had just realized the ground beneath her feet wasn't as stable as she thought. Daniel's mother remained silent, but the anger in her eyes had shifted direction. It wasn't aimed at me anymore, it was aimed squarely at her daughter. I took a slow breath. For 15 years, Danielle had always been the partner in difficult situations. The one who paused before speaking. The one who believed that decisions made in anger usually determined correct choices. Standing there in the quiet living room, I suddenly understood why he had always come there. Because power isn't about shouting, it's about knowing when you don't have to. Margaret's voice came again, sharp and whispered. Well, I walked slowly towards the coffee table and looked down at the folder Mr. Pierce had kept. Inside it were the documents Danielle had signed. Legal documents. His last way of making sure I didn't leave it unanswered. I placed my hand gently on the folder, and I looked at Margaret. Earlier today, I said calmly, you told me to pack my things. Margaret's jaw tightened. This house belongs to the Hayes family. I nodded slowly. Yes. Then I looked back at him. At least that's what you believe. Silence stretched between us. Margaret shifted her weight between her hands. That has nothing to do with the home. Actually, I replied quietly, it has everything to do with it. Danielle's mother finally spoke again. What exactly are you saying, Eleanor? I changed word now. I'm saying that today has been a very long day. No one interrupted. I buried my husband this morning, I continued. The man I shared 15 years with in childhood. My voice stayed calm, remembering me as a chess player. And a few hours later, I walked into my own living room and was told I didn't belong there. Margaret looked away. I continued. I was told to leave the house where I built my life, where Daniel and I celebrated birthdays, where we hosted holidays, where we planned our future. The room stayed completely still. So when you ask me what I want, I said slowly, the answer is actually very simple. Margaret's eyes lifted again. What? I looked at her directly. I want you to understand me for a second. Her expression hardened immediately. That's not an answer. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. It is. I reached down and picked up the folder. know, I replied calmly. You're reading inside. The difference was subtle, but it was real. Margaret looked like she was struggling to process the situation. You're serious? Yes. Her voice dropped. You're doing this because of what happened to you. I thought about that. Then I shook my head. No, she frowned. Then why? I glanced briefly at the photograph on the wall. It showed Daniel and Margaret in their 50s, smiling, happy. Before everything had changed. Because Daniel questioned his mother's decision to keep her alive. Margaret sniffled. When ruining my life is that way, I looked back at her. No. She tried to calm me. The room fell silent again. After a moment, I added one final sentence. But unlike you, I'm giving you time to fix it. Margaret didn't respond. For the first time since she walked into my house, she had nothing left to tell me. Mr. Pierce closed his book. I'll contact you tomorrow morning when I finish this document. Margaret nodded slowly before stepping out. Daniel's mother looked briefly at me. Then she said something unexpected. Daniel told you. I didn't answer, because the truth was, Daniel hadn't told me something scary. He had simply told me something that could only have happened inside my head. Margaret and her mother left the house a few minutes later. Their cars pulled out of the driveway at the light. When the silence returned, the house finally felt very different. Mr. Pierce paused at the door again. Daniel loved you very much, he said. I know, I told her. After he left, I walked into the living room and sat down near him. The same couch was the only one I used to watch movies on for weekends. The house felt empty without me, though it didn't feel threatened anymore, because the people who